Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back through nearly 1,000 years of English history, watching as warring tribes become a kingdom, as that kingdom survives Viking fury, as Norman knights reshape everything, and as constitutional ideas slowly, inevitably emerge from the chaos. You probably won't survive this journey fully awake. And that's exactly the point. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a windswept British shore in the year 410 AD, watching the last Roman legions march away. The eagles that cast shadows across these islands for nearly 4 centuries are leaving, and you can feel the weight of their absence settling like fog. The roads they built still stretch across the landscape, straight and purposeful, but already weeds push through the paving stones. The fortresses that guarded the frontiers stand empty, their gates creaking in the salt wind. Rome has withdrawn, not because Britain ceased to matter, but because Rome itself is crumbling under the weight of barbarian invasions. You're witnessing the end of the only world these islands have known for generations. And honestly, the timing couldn't be worse for everyone left behind. The Romano-British population, those who've lived under imperial rule and adopted Latin ways, Christian faith, and a certain expectation of order, now face an uncertain future. Some flee westward toward Wales and Cornwall, carrying with them flickering flames of Roman civilization. Others remain, adapting to whatever comes next. Still others take up arms. Historians still argue whether a war leader named Arthur emerged during this period, rallying the Romano-British against the advancing tide, or whether Arthur represents the collective memory of many such desperate defenders. Either way, the legend speaks to something profound about this moment, when the old world was dying and the new world struggled to be born. Across the North Sea, beyond storm-gathered horizons, restless tribes are preparing for journeys that will change everything. The Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians, driven by population pressure, climate shifts, and that eternal human hunger for better lands, turn their eyes toward Britain's fertile valleys. What follows isn't a single dramatic invasion, but a centuries-long migration, a gradual transformation of the British landscape. They come not as one unified army, but as individual warbands, each following their own lord, each seeking their own portion of this promised land. They bring their gods with them. Tiw, the one-handed war deity, Woden the wanderer, Thunern the thunder god, and Frigg the goddess of love, names that still survive in your days of the week. If you've ever wondered about that Tuesday morning exhaustion, the Saxon kingdoms that eventually emerge are unlike anything Britain has known. These aren't sophisticated Roman administrative units, but personal domains based on bonds between lord and warrior, between protector and protected. The king isn't a distant marble palace figure, but a war leader who must prove his worth in battle, who rewards followers with gold and land, who embodies the virtues his people hold dear, or at least tries to. on good days. In the great halls of these early kingdoms, warriors gather around fires, casting dancing shadows on carved pillars. Here the shop, the court poet, recites tales of heroes and monsters. When they sing of Beowulf fighting Grendel, they're not merely entertaining themselves, but defining what heroism means in their world, which, let's be honest, involves significantly more monster wrestling than most modern job descriptions require. Yet, even as these pagan kingdoms establish themselves, another force is preparing to transform them utterly. In Irish and Scottish monasteries, Christian monks have preserved not only the Gospels, but much of the ancient world's learning. These Celtic missionaries, carrying their revolutionary message, began journeying southward. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity is not a simple replacement of one belief system with another, but a complex centuries-long negotiation. When King Edwin of Northumbria reportedly compared pagan life to a sparrow flying through a warm hall on a winter's night, emerging from darkness, enjoying brief warmth and light, then disappearing again into unknown cold, he captured something essential. Christianity offered hope that there might be more than darkness beyond the hall, that death might not end all things. One quirky detail: the Synod of Whitby in 664 debated matters like the proper Easter date and monastic hairstyle, which might seem trivial until you realize these reflected deeper questions about authority and unity that would shape English Christianity for centuries. The great Northumbrian monasteries, like Jarrow, became centers of learning rivaling any in Europe. The Lindisfarne Gospels, with their intricate interlaced patterns and glowing colors, represent the perfect fusion of Celtic artistry with Christian devotion. The Venerable Bede, writing at Jarrow, produced his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, a work that didn't just record conversion, but helped create a sense of English identity transcending individual kingdom boundaries. By the 8th century's dawn, Anglo-Saxon England had achieved a remarkable synthesis of Germanic warrior culture and Christian civilization. With sophisticated governmental structures, rich artistic traditions, and extensive trade networks, English missionaries were even carrying the gospel to continental Europe, while English scholars contributed to the Carolingian Renaissance. It was, you might say, something of a golden age, which naturally means something terrible is about to happen, because that's how history works. You're standing on the holy island of Lindisfarne on June 8th, 793 AD, when dragon-proud ships materialize from the morning mist. The Vikings have arrived, and they're not here for the theology discussions. The attack is swift, brutal, and utterly shocking to the Anglo-Saxon world. Monks who've dedicated their lives to prayer and scholarship suddenly face armed warriors who view monasteries not as sacred spaces but as convenient treasure boxes. The psychological impact ripples across England like a stone cast into still water. These raiders understand exactly what they're doing. Monasteries contain the greatest concentrations of portable wealth. Monks can't fight back, and desecrating holy sites spreads terror that paralyzes resistance far more effectively than any army could. The Vikings, calculated predators, not random barbarians, perfect the art of the lightning strike. Their shallow draft ships penetrate far inland via rivers, bringing terror to communities that never expected seaborne raids. As the ninth century progresses, the nature of Viking activity changes. What started as seasonal raiding expeditions evolves into permanent occupation. The Great Heathen Army landing in East Anglia in 865 isn't a raiding party, but a force of conquest, led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless, systematically conquering kingdom after kingdom. Some English rulers choose martyrdom rather than compromise. King Edmund of East Anglia becomes a saint for his refusal to submit. Others simply flee or surrender. But in Wessex, a different response takes shape under a young king who will become known as Alfred the Great, though he probably didn't feel particularly great while hiding in Somerset marshes. Which brings us to one of history's more awkward moments for royalty. Alfred's greatness lies not merely in military achievements, but in understanding that defeating Vikings requires transforming English society itself. In winter 878, the Viking leader Guthrum launches a surprise attack on Chippenham during Twelfth Night celebrations, because nothing says tactical genius like ruining everyone's holiday party. Alfred barely escapes with his life, reduced to a fugitive in his own kingdom. But from this nadir, he begins weaving threads of recovery, using ancient beacon systems to spread word that the king still lives, that resistance remains possible. The response is remarkable. Men gather from villages and farms, fighting not because law compels them, but because they believe in something larger. The Battle of Edington in May 878 becomes more than military victory. It's a moment of national awakening, where the myth of Viking invincibility finally shatters. Alfred's true genius reveals itself in victory's aftermath. Rather than simply expelling Vikings, he chooses a path reshaping England's entire future. The Treaty of Wedmore establishes a formal boundary between English and Viking territories, the Danelaw, and requires Guthrum to accept Christian baptism, with Alfred serving as godfather. This political theater carries profound implications, beginning a cultural integration process that transforms both peoples. Historians still debate whether Alfred's educational reforms or his military innovations mattered more. But the Anglo-Saxon chronicle he established, a year-by-year English history written in the vernacular rather than Latin, created shared English identity for the first time. People could read about their own history in their own language, connecting themselves to a narrative stretching back to the first Anglo-Saxon settlers, which is basically the medieval equivalent of binge watching your family's greatest hits. Alfred's military reforms created foundations for future English success. The old system of seasonal levies, where farmers abandoned fields to fight briefly each year, proved hopelessly inadequate against professional Viking armies. Alfred divided forces into two groups, one fighting while the other tended land, ensuring the kingdom maintained both military readiness and economic productivity. He also began constructing burhs, fortified towns, serving as both refuges and military bases. These burhs represented more than defensive installations. They were engines of social transformation designed to support permanent populations of craftsmen, traders, and administrators. Streets were laid out in regular patterns, plots assigned for houses and workshops, markets established under royal protection. The burhs became commerce and industry centers, attracting merchants from across Europe and fostering a money economy, gradually replacing the old barter and tribute system. Alfred's successors, Edward the Elder and Athelstan, continued his work, extending the burh system throughout reconquered territories. Athelstan's victory at Brunanburh in 937 marked the final consolidation of English power. The coalition of Vikings, Scots, and Welsh facing the English army represented the last serious challenge to the new order. The battle itself was remembered as one of the bloodiest in English history, with casualties so heavy that, according to the Chronicle, never before had such slaughter been made by the sword's edge. But victory was decisive, establishing Athelstan as the first king who could truly claim to rule all of England, a title that actually meant something, unlike modern middle management job descriptions. The 10th century witnessed the flowering of distinctive English culture, combining Anglo-Saxon traditions with Christian learning and Viking innovations. Great monasteries were rebuilt on grander scales. Manuscript illumination reached new artistic heights, and architecture evolved from simple wooden structures to sophisticated stone buildings. Edgar the Peaceful's reign from 959 to 975 represented this process's culmination. His coronation at Bath in 973, attended by representatives from across the British Isles, including Scottish kings and Welsh princes acknowledging his supremacy, was carefully designed to emphasize kingship's sacred nature. The administrative system emerging during this period was remarkably sophisticated. The country divided into shires governed by sheriffs answering directly to the king, local courts handling minor disputes, while major cases reached the royal court, and a system of writs, written commands under the royal seal, allowing unprecedented communication efficiency throughout the kingdom. You're standing on Senlac Hill near Hastings on October 14, 1066, watching two civilizations prepare to collide with world-changing force. The morning air tastes of salt and iron, and you can hear the rhythmic thud of English axes striking shields as Harold Godwinson's forces lock themselves into the ancient shield wall formation. They hold the high ground, their position seemingly impregnable, their battle cries echoing across the valley as they prepare to meet the Norman charge. Across the field, William of Normandy's army represents the cutting edge of European military innovation. Heavy cavalry trained to fight as coordinated units, archers drawn from across northern France, and infantry working together in ways that multiply their effectiveness. The succession crisis that brought these armies to this field began when Edward the Confessor died childless in January, leaving multiple claimants arguing over who deserved the crown. Harold had the strongest power base. William claimed Edward had promised him the succession years earlier, and Edgar the Aveling possessed the best hereditary claim, but lacked political muscle. Medieval politics, as it turns out, rarely reward the most legitimate candidate, just the most dangerous one. The battle itself becomes a masterpiece of medieval warfare, a clash historians will study for centuries. Norman cavalry charge again and again against the English shield wall, seeking to break through by sheer determination. The English hold their ground with stubborn courage, their axes cutting down horses and riders with devastating effect. For hours the outcome hangs in balance, neither side gaining decisive advantage. Then comes the turning point. A rumor spreads through Norman ranks that William has been killed. The panic nearly breaks the Norman army until William appears, helmet raised to show his face, rallying his men for one final effort. The feinted retreat that follows, drawing sections of the English line forward where they can be surrounded and destroyed, is tactical deception at its finest. Harold's death, struck down by Norman arrows and swords while defending his banner, marks the end of Anglo-Saxon England. Around him falls the flower of English nobility, men whose families had ruled for generations, their blood soaking into Sussex soil that would become foundation for a new order. William's march to London after Hastings is psychological warfare perfected. Rather than advancing directly on the capital, he sweeps through southern counties, systematically destroying everything in his path. The message is unmistakably clear. Resistance brings utter devastation. Town after town submits without fight, recognizing the old order is dead and survival requires accommodation. The coronation of William as King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, at Westminster Abbey, conducted by English bishops in the presence of Norman nobles, symbolizes the fusion of two traditions. But even as the crown is placed upon William's head, sounds of rioting can be heard outside, a reminder that conquest is only the first step in creating a unified realm. One quirky detail often overlooked. William had to wait for the rioting to stop before the ceremony could conclude, which must have made for the most awkward coronation in English history. The rebellions that erupt in following years test whether Norman military prowess can create institutions necessary for lasting rule. The harrying of the North in 1069 to 1070 becomes a campaign of deliberate devastation, transforming Yorkshire into wasteland. For months, Norman forces systematically destroy everything supporting human life. Mills demolished, bridges broken, salt scattered on fields, preventing future cultivation. The population flees southward in desperate columns, leaving behind silence that will endure for generations. Historians still argue whether this constituted genocide or simply medieval warfare's brutal logic. But contemporary sources describe regions where no smoke rose from any hearth for decades. The psychological impact extends far beyond Yorkshire. Word of devastation spreads throughout England, carried by refugees whose hollow eyes testify to resistance's price. Further rebellions die not in battle, but in cold calculation of nobles recognizing that continued defiance brings only annihilation. Yet, even while demonstrating capacity for ruthless suppression, William simultaneously lays foundations for new government transforming England more profoundly than any previous invasion. The feudal system he imposes isn't merely military organization, but complete reimagining of how power, land, and loyalty should be distributed. Every acre of English soil is now held directly or indirectly from the king, creating a pyramid of obligation extending from humblest peasant to greatest earl. The Domesday Book, That extraordinary survey commissioned in 1085 reveals this transformation's scope. For the first time in history, a medieval kingdom undergoes systematic accounting recording not just land ownership, but its value, population, productive capacity, and obligations to the crown. The surveyors traveling from manor to manor, asking relentless questions about livestock and plowland, mills and fish ponds, villages and forests, are creating more than tax assessment. They're mapping the sinews of a new kind of state, which makes them history's least popular dinner guests. The Norman aristocracy emerging from this process is unlike any ruling class England has known. These aren't traditional war leaders bound to followers by personal loyalty and treasure distribution. Norman barons are landlords in the most literal sense, deriving power from systematic agricultural exploitation and owing positions to royal grant rather than ancestral right. Their castles, rising like stone mountains from the English landscape, are not merely fortresses, but administration centers, symbols of new order, combining military dominance with bureaucratic efficiency. The White Tower of London, begun by William himself, epitomizes this new architectural language of power, rising nearly 100 feet above the Thames. Its massive walls constructed from imported Caen stone, designed to impress and intimidate equally. The tower isn't merely fortress, but royal palace, treasury, arsenal, and prison combined into single structure, proclaiming Norman rule's permanence more effectively than any proclamation. The church, too, undergoes transformation, extending beyond personnel changes. The new Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc of Bec, is a scholar and administrator whose ecclesiastical reform vision reshapes English Christianity for centuries. Under his guidance, the English Church aligns more closely with continental practices. Monasteries reformed according to latest European models. Cathedral schools expanded to educate new clergy generations trained in theology and administration. The architectural revolution accompanying these changes is no less dramatic than the landscape's military transformation. Small wooden churches serving Anglo-Saxon communities are replaced by massive stone cathedrals rivaling any in Europe. You're standing at Runnymede on June 15, 1215, watching King John reluctantly seal a document that will echo through centuries of constitutional history. The Great Charter, Magna Carta, hammered out through weeks of negotiation between the king and his barons, contains 63 clauses establishing principles that will eventually evolve into foundations of English liberty. The famous clause declaring that no free man can be imprisoned or dispossessed except by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land creates a legal framework that will eventually extend protection to all subjects of the crown. But the immediate impact is to plunge England into civil war, because John repudiates the charter within months, supported by Pope Innocent III, who declares it invalid since it was extracted by force. Turns out forced contracts don't hold up well in medieval court, which is probably a lesson someone should have anticipated. The road to Runnymede began generations earlier with Henry II, who ascended the throne in 1154, determined to restore order after the anarchy of Stephen's reign. Henry possessed territory stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, the age of an empire, making him the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine added southern France's wealth and cultural sophistication to his domains. Most importantly, his education in Norman efficient government traditions prepared him to rebuild the administrative system civil war had damaged. The restoration Henry accomplished during his first decade was remarkable in scope. Illegal castles demolished, royal forests restocked, coinage reformed, and most significantly, royal justice expanded and systematized. The constitutions of Clarendon issued in 1164 established procedures for justice administration that would endure long after the Norman dynasty passed into history. The system of royal courts staffed by professional judges and guided by written law created judicial framework functioning independently of individual kings' personal authority. The conflict between Henry and Thomas Becket, his former chancellor turned Archbishop of Canterbury, represented more than personal quarrel between old friends. It was fundamental clash between secular and ecclesiastical authority shaping church-state relationships for centuries. Becket's transformation from worldly administrator to saintly martyr demonstrated religious idealism's continuing power in an age increasingly dominated by bureaucratic efficiency. The murder of Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on December 29, 1170 shocked the medieval world and transformed the ambitious archbishop into one of Christendom's most powerful saints. Henry's public penance at Becket's tomb, where he submitted to scourging by cathedral monks, demonstrated that even the most powerful medieval king remained subject to spiritual authority, which must have been a humbling experience for someone accustomed to getting his way. Henry's sons proved less capable than their father at maintaining the empire he'd built. Richard I, who succeeded in 1189, spoke French as his native tongue, spent most of his life in Aquitaine, and viewed England not as homeland to be cherished, but as treasury to be emptied pursuing greater adventures. His obsession with the Holy Land and determination to reclaim Jerusalem from Saladin reflected a fundamental shift in European nobility's priorities. The Third Crusade, which Richard led, represented the culmination of the crusading movement's evolution from spontaneous religious fervor into sophisticated international enterprise, combining spiritual motivation with practical politics. Historians still debate whether Richard's military genius at sieges like Acre justified the enormous costs his crusade imposed on England. But most agree the answer is probably no, but it made for excellent legends. Richard's capture by Leopold of Austria during his return journey transformed the absent king into a suffering symbol resonating throughout his domains. The enormous ransom demanded for his release, equivalent to twice the annual revenue of the English crown, required financial innovations with profound governmental consequences. The taxation necessary to raise this sum couldn't be accomplished through traditional feudal obligations, but required consent and cooperation from social groups never before systematically consulted about royal policy. The assemblies summoned to approve extraordinary taxation. The representatives called to London to speak for their communities. The arguments made about royal authority's limits and subjects' rights. All established precedents remembered when future kings sought to extract resources from reluctant people. The negotiations preceding Richard's ransom collection marked the beginning of a new crown-subject relationship, eventually evolving into parliamentary government. When Richard's brother John inherited the throne in 1199, he faced challenges that would have tested even the most capable ruler. John's reputation for treachery, established during his brother's Crusade absence, preceded him and colored every action he took as king. The loss of Normandy in 1204, that catastrophic defeat costing the English crown its ancestral homeland, was more than military disaster. It was psychological, blow-shattering Anglo-Norman nobility's confidence and forcing them to choose between English and continental identities. The barons, who'd held lands on both sides of the Channel for generations, found themselves compelled to abandon one set of estates or the other, creating resentments poisoning John's relationship with his nobility for his reign's remainder. One peculiar quirk: John earned the nickname Lackland because his father struggled to find suitable territories for the youngest son, which is medieval parent speak for "we didn't plan this far ahead." The financial crisis resulting from Normandy's lost revenues forced John to explore new taxation methods, bringing him into conflict with every segment of English society. The dispute between John and Pope Innocent III over Archbishop of Canterbury appointment escalated into conflict, transforming church-state relationships throughout Europe. The interdict the Pope placed on England, forbidding mass celebration and sacrament administration, created spiritual crisis affecting every society level. John's excommunication itself, declared in 1209, provided his enemies with powerful weapons, justifying rebellion and resistance. The baronial opposition emerging during John's later years was unlike any previous challenge to royal authority. Led by men like Robert Fitzwalter and Eustace de Vesey, this movement combined practical grievances about taxation and legal procedure with theoretical arguments about royal power's limits, drawing upon both English custom and continental legal theory. The barons confronting John at Runnymede weren't merely defending their own privileges, but articulating governmental principles influencing political development for centuries. The civil war consuming John's final years was fought with bitterness, reflecting feudal bonds' collapse that once united king and nobles. The devastation this conflict brought to the English countryside, the foreign mercenaries ravaging land in service of competing claimants, the law and order breakdown making travel dangerous and commerce impossible, all demonstrated political failure's terrible cost. John's death at Newark in October 1216 came when his cause seemed most hopeless, leaving his 9-year-old son Henry to inherit this desperate situation. You're standing in the cold October dawn at Agincourt in 1415, watching Henry V's exhausted, outnumbered army face a French force that seems invincible. The English longbowmen, ankle-deep in mud, prepare to release arrows that will create a legend inspiring English patriots for centuries. But before we reach this glorious moment, England must first endure catastrophes that would test whether the governmental institutions built over centuries could survive the ultimate crisis: plague, social upheaval, and dynastic collapse. The reign of Edward III, beginning in 1327 after his father's deposition, marks the beginning of England's most ambitious period. The young king, who learned warfare during his youth's baronial conflicts, brings to the throne a combination of military skill and political vision, transforming England into one of Europe's most formidable powers. His claim to the French throne, advanced in 1337 based on descent from Philip IV through his mother Isabella, provides pretext for conflict, defining English foreign policy for over a century. The great victory at Crusades in 1346, where Edward's army destroys French chivalry's flower through mass archery's devastating effectiveness, marks the beginning of English military supremacy enduring for generations. The Black Death striking England in 1348 represents a catastrophe dwarfing any military defeat or political crisis the kingdom has yet experienced. The plague, originating in Central Asia and spreading along medieval trade routes, kills perhaps a third of England's population, transforming every aspect of society in ways taking centuries to understand fully. The labor shortage resulting from the plague's devastation gives surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power, leading to wage increases and social mobility threatening feudal society's entire structure. The Statute of Labourers, passed by Parliament in 1351, represents desperate attempts to freeze wages and social relationships at pre-plague levels. But economic forces the plague unleashed prove stronger than any legislation can contain. Historians still debate whether the Black Death accelerated social changes already underway or fundamentally redirected English development. But everyone agrees the answer involves significantly fewer people than before. The Good Parliament of 1376, meeting in Edward III's final years, demonstrates how completely the political balance has shifted. The Commons, emboldened by their role financing French wars, begin asserting authority in ways that would have been unthinkable under earlier kings. The impeachment of corrupt officials, the demand for regular accounting of royal expenditures, the insistence that taxation require genuine parliamentary consent, all establish precedents, eventually transforming English government's nature. When Edward III dies in 1377, his grandson Richard II inherits a kingdom where traditional feudal relationships are breaking down and new forms of political consultation are emerging whether kings like it or not. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 represents the culmination of social tensions building since the Black Death. The poll tax triggering the uprising is merely the final straw, breaking the patience of a peasantry enduring decades of oppression. The rebels marching on London under Wat Tyler and John Ball's leadership articulate demands going far beyond tax relief, calling for serfdom's abolition, wealth redistribution, and a more egalitarian society. The dramatic confrontation at Smithfield, where young Richard II faces rebel leaders personally, demonstrates both courage and cunning characterizing his reign. The king's promise to grant rebel demands, his apparent sympathy for their grievances, his willingness to risk personal safety preventing further violence, all create a legend inspiring future monarchs. Yet the brutal suppression following, the execution of leaders, the old order's restoration, all reveal that even the most dramatic royal sympathy gestures cannot overcome medieval society's fundamental inequalities. which is basically the 14th century equivalent of "We hear your concerns." But no, Richard II's reign evolves from this promising beginning to tragic conclusion, demonstrating the fragility of medieval political arrangements. The king possesses intelligence, education, and royal charisma his immediate predecessors lacked. Yet he faces challenges testing not just personal character, but English government's very foundations. The merciless Parliament following demonstrates that constitutional weapons forged during previous crises can be turned against the crown itself. Richard's response: spending a decade carefully rebuilding authority using legal precedents while maintaining constitutional government's appearance, shows that parliamentary limitations can be circumvented by rulers skilled in political manipulation. The Revolution of 1399, bringing Henry of Bolingbroke to the throne as Henry IV, represents more than simple dynasty change. It's a constitutional crisis reshaping crown-parliament relationships for centuries. The Duke of Lancaster's claim based on hereditary right and parliamentary recognition establishes precedents, eventually transforming English kingship's nature. The deposition of Richard II, carried out through parliamentary procedures giving legal sanction to what's essentially a military coup, demonstrates that even royal authorities' most sacred aspects are subject to popular consent. Henry IV's reign proves that winning thrones is easier than keeping them, especially when legitimacy remains questionable. The rebellions erupting throughout his reign, from Owen Glendower's Welsh uprising to the Percy family's northern revolts, all draw strength from Lancastrian rule's fundamental illegitimacy, which makes for approximately 15 years of "I told you so" from Richard II's supporters. Henry V's accession in 1413 marks the beginning of the most glorious period in medieval English history. The renewal of the French War provides opportunity to unite his divided kingdom behind common cause, while demonstrating English military superiority survived previous generations' constitutional upheavals. The conquest of Normandy following Agincourt shows Henry possesses not just military genius necessary to win battles, but administrative skills required to govern conquered territories. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, recognizing Henry as heir to the French throne, seems to promise realization of English ambitions frustrated for generations. Yet Henry's triumph's very completeness contains future disaster seeds. The king uniting England behind French ambitions dies when achievements seem most secure, leaving an infant son to inherit territories maintainable only through constant warfare. The gradual loss of French territories during Henry VI's minority reveals how completely English success depended on individual kings' personal authority. Joan of Arc's inspired leadership at Orleans in 1429 transforms French military capabilities, marking the beginning of recovery, eventually driving English from all continental possessions except Calais. The mental illness afflicting Henry VI beginning in the 1450s creates authority crisis, ultimately destroying the Lancastrian dynasty. The factional conflicts erupting as nobles compete for control of the helpless king gradually escalate into civil war remembered as the Wars of the Roses. The battles of St. Albans, Towton, Barnet, and Tewkesbury, fought with ruthlessness exceeding anything seen in previous English conflicts, demonstrate that the Wars of the Roses represent not merely dynastic disputes, but struggles between competing visions of English government. The brief reign of Edward V in 1483 and his mysterious disappearance in the Tower creates the medieval period's final crisis. Richard II's usurpation, justified through claims about his predecessor's children's illegitimacy, demonstrates that constitutional principles established during previous centuries can still be manipulated by ruthless individuals understanding the system's weaknesses. The rebellion against Richard's rule, Henry Tudor's invasion, the Battle of Bosworth Field, where the last Plantagenet king dies fighting for his crown, all mark the medieval age's end and the Tudor period's beginning. As Henry VII surveys the kingdom he's won through combination of hereditary claim, military victory, and political calculation, he inherits institutions tested by nearly 1,000 years of crisis, conflict, and gradual constitutional development that will eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world. And so, as the mists of medieval time finally begin to fade, you find yourself drifting gently away from those ancient shores where kings rose and fell like tides. The England that emerged from nearly 1,000 years of transformation, from Roman withdrawal to Tudor dawn, was no longer a collection of warring tribes, but a nation with identity, purpose, and institutions that would endure far beyond any single ruler's lifetime. The constitutional principles forged in crisis, the legal traditions emerging from custom, the parliamentary procedures developing through necessity, all became foundations upon which modern democracy would eventually build. As sleep carries you deeper into peaceful darkness, let these images soften and blur. The Saxon halls with their flickering fires, the Norman cathedrals with their soaring arches, the muddy fields of Agincourt where courage wrote itself into legend. If you enjoyed this journey through medieval England's long saga, perhaps leave a like or share your thoughts about which period fascinated you most. But for now, let go of dates and battles, kings and chronicles. Let the weight of centuries settle gently around you like a familiar blanket. The story has been told, the journey complete, and in the silence that follows, may you find the deepest, most restorative sleep, knowing that those distant voices from England's past have finally fallen quiet, waiting patiently in history's pages until you choose to visit them again.